It was 1874. A group of 15 cowboys was crossing Kansas toward Colorado, driving more than 2,000 head of cattle along the Chisholm Trail. They had left Texas 43 days earlier. Supplies were halfway gone. The money to buy more food in the next town depended on arriving alive with the herd intact. And the only man responsible for feeding all of them 3 times a day, 7 days a week, with whatever was in a single wooden chest strapped to the back of a wagon, was an old cook named Amos Webb. Amos was 62 years old. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in a blacksmith accident when he was young. He cooked with a single cast iron pan he had carried with him for 18 years. And in those 43 days, he had prepared more than 120 different meals, without a refrigerator, without a stove, without a recipe book, without the slightest certainty that tomorrow's ingredients would be available. The cowboys called Amos the most important man on the journey. Not the group's leader, not the most skilled gunman, the cook. Because in the real Old West, food was not comfort. It was survival. And the cast iron pan was not a kitchen utensil. It was a tool for life. Today we're going to explore 12 meals that came out of those pans. Simple, rough, and at the same time ingenious meals, made with the bare minimum, to feed men who had no choice but to be grateful. And by the end, you will understand why some of these meals have stood the test of time and still make sense today. To understand these meals, you first need to understand what was available. A cattle drive cook's chest was a work of brutal planning. Every inch had a purpose. Every ingredient was chosen by 3 criteria alone: weight, durability, and versatility. There was no room for anything that did not serve multiple purposes. Dried beans were the most valuable ingredient. They weighed little, lasted months, and provided protein and carbohydrates. Wheat flour came next, the base for quick breads, a thickener for soups, an ingredient in anything that needed substance. Salt pork was the group's fat, the caloric source that kept bodies moving through 12-hour days in the saddle. Coffee was almost as essential as water. Molasses, a dark, dense byproduct of sugar production, sweetened, preserved, and in cases of necessity provided quick energy when there was nothing else left. Beyond the chest, there was what the land offered: game, river fish, wild plants that the most experienced men knew how to identify. And it was the combination of these fixed elements with the variable offerings of the territory that defined the menu each day. The cast iron pan was the center of everything. Heavy, nearly indestructible, it retained heat evenly, could go directly into the fire or be buried in coals, and it improved with use. Each layer of cooked fat deposited onto its surface, creating a natural non-stick coating that no modern pan can replicate with the same history. It was in this pan that the following 12 meals were born. Not in kitchens, over fires, under open sky, with wind and dust and the smell of cattle all around. And even so, they fed. The first meal was the most common of all, served with a frequency that bordered on ritual: beans with salt pork. It was simple to the point of seeming insignificant. Pinto beans soaked the night before, when there was time, or thrown directly into the pan with plenty of water when there was not. Chunks of salt pork cut roughly and added to the still cold water, so the fat would melt slowly and permeate every bean during the hours of cooking. Nothing more. Sometimes a little wild onion when someone had found some along the way. Rarely extra salt. The pork already brought enough. The result was a dense, dark mass with a thick broth that stuck to the bottom of the pan and had to be scraped up with a wooden spoon. It was not pretty. The smell was strong, heavy, animal. But a bowl of that sustained a man through 8 hours of hard work without complaint. Amos Webb had a rule about beans that he passed on to younger assistants. Beans are never done before you think they are. Always cook them 30 more minutes after they seem ready. Undercooked beans on the Old West Trail caused violent cramps that could put a man out of commission for days. On a cattle drive, a man out of commission was a serious problem. The beans had to be completely soft, completely cooked, with no resistance to the bite. It was the first meal any frontier cook learned. And for many cowboys, it was the meal they most associated with the end of a long day. The smell of beans cooking being the first thing they noticed when the camp appeared on the horizon. The second meal was what they called son-of-a-gun stew, literally untranslatable. But the secret of it was a stew made from the parts of the animal that nobody wanted to admit they were eating. When an animal was slaughtered, a steer that had broken its leg, a cow that would not survive the journey, nothing was wasted. The prime cuts went to special occasions or dried to preserve. What remained, the offal, the heart, the liver, the kidney, the lung, the tongue, went straight into the pan. Everything was cut into small, irregular pieces with no concern for presentation. The pan was heated with a little animal fat, and the pieces were seared at high temperature to create a dark, aromatic crust that concentrated the flavor. Hot water was added next, along with whatever else was available: wild roots, onion, pieces of hard bread to thicken the broth. The smell during cooking was intense and difficult to describe for anyone who has never worked with offal. Strong, metallic, organic. But after hours in the pan, something happened. The flavors merged, the textures softened, and what had begun as a collection of rejected parts transformed into a deep and complex broth that warmed the body from the inside out. The older cowboys considered son of a gun stew the most honest meal of the Old West. Not because it's good, but because it represented a fundamental truth. In a world of the frontier, you ate what there was, and you learned to be grateful for it. The third meal was pan cornbread. Cornbread cooked over coals instead of in an oven, and which for most settlers was the only bread they knew for months at a stretch. The batter was mixed directly in the pan or in a separate container when one was available. Cornmeal, a little wheat flour when available, melted lard, water or milk when there was a cow nearby, and sometimes a hen's egg that some settler family carried with them in a straw crate. Baking soda made the bread rise slightly, not in the airy way of modern breads, but enough that it did not come out completely dense as stone. The pan was greased with lard, the batter poured in, and the lid placed on top with coals both above and below, a technique called Dutch oven cooking that distributed heat relatively evenly and allowed a result surprisingly close to what came out of a real oven. The cornbread came out golden on the outside, moist on the inside, with a slightly sweet flavor that contrasted with the austerity of everything around it. It was served alongside the beans, dunked into the thick broth, and was probably the closest thing to genuine culinary pleasure that most cowboys experienced during months on the trail. A settler woman named Martha Farnsworth, who crossed Kansas in 1878 with her husband and 3 children, wrote in her diary that cornbread was the only thing her children asked for when they reached camp at the end of the day. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was familiar. In a world where everything was new and much was frightening, the taste of cornbread from the same old pan was the only piece of normalcy she could offer. The fourth meal was called mulligan stew, the soup of whatever was on hand, which had no recipe because the recipe was literally whatever was available that day. The principle was simple: water in the pan, fire underneath, and everything edible inside. Rehydrated jerky, already cooked beans, wild potatoes found along the way, onion, whatever vegetables someone had traded with settlers or bought in the last town, wild herbs the cook recognized as safe. Mulligan stew was the meal of forced creativity. It was what happened when supplies were running low and the next town was uncertain. It was the ultimate demonstration of the Old West's culinary philosophy. You discard nothing, you combine everything, you heat it well, and you serve it with gratitude. Cowboys had an expression to describe a good cook, someone who could make a mulligan stew you wanted to have again, because anyone could throw ingredients into a pan of water. The skill lay in knowing the order, knowing the timing for each element, knowing when to add salt, and when the pork salt was already enough, knowing when the fire needed to be high and when it needed to drop to a slow ember that drew out flavor without destroying texture. Amos Webb said that mulligan stew was where you discovered whether a cook was truly good or merely competent. With abundant, quality ingredients, anyone could cook well. With leftovers, creativity, and pressure, the real cooks revealed themselves. The fifth meal was rarer, reserved for days of successful hunting: venison stew with wild roots. When someone brought down a deer, which happened more frequently in certain regions and seasons, fresh meat was an event. There was no way to preserve all of it, so the pan was immediately put over the fire with the less noble cuts. The neck, the smaller ribs, the front legs, parts that needed slow time to become tender. Generous pieces were seared in hot fat until dark on the outside, not for aesthetics, but because the crust created retained the internal juices during the slow cooking that followed. Hot water covered everything, and the fire was reduced to the bare minimum. 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes more, depending on the age of the animal and the toughness of the meat. The wild roots, burdock, camas, or whatever the territory offered, were added in the last hour when the meat was already nearly falling apart. They absorbed the dark, intense broth, swelled, and created a texture that complemented the meat in a way any chef today would recognize as accomplished cooking. It was on these days, with the venison stew served in metal mugs, that the cowboys fell silent around the fire. Not from sadness, from genuine satisfaction. A satisfaction that most modern people, with access to any food at any hour, rarely experience. Because real satisfaction from food requires, first of all, real hunger. The sixth meal was what cowboys called sourdough biscuits, naturally leavened biscuits that the cook carried in a sealed ceramic or metal pot, keeping alive a starter culture that in some cases was years old. The process was one of the most sophisticated things that happened in those improvised kitchens, even though no one called it sophisticated. The cook saved a bit of the previous day's dough, the so-called starter, the wild yeast culture, mixed it with fresh flour and water in the morning, let it rest while the camp woke up, and then formed small rounds that went into a greased pan over low coals. The result was a slightly sour biscuit with a thin, breakable crust on the outside and a soft, moist interior that still came out hot and steaming when split in half. Served with dark molasses drizzled on top, it was probably the closest thing to luxury that most cowboys experienced during months on the trail. The starter culture was cared for with an attention that bordered on affection. Some cooks slept with the pot close to their body on cold nights to maintain the temperature necessary for the yeast to survive. The death of the culture, from extreme cold, contamination, or neglect, was an event genuinely mourned because it meant weeks before a new culture reached the maturity needed to produce quality biscuits. It was a relationship with food that most people today do not experience. A living responsibility. A presence that needed to be fed in order to keep feeding others. The seventh meal was rice with molasses, simple to the extreme, and exactly for that reason, perfect for mornings when time was short and the group needed to be moving before the sun grew too hot. Rice cooked in abundant water until very soft, almost mushy. Molasses poured on top in whatever quantity each man wanted. And molasses was taken seriously because beyond sweetening, it provided iron, calcium, and a considerable amount of fast-absorbing energy that a body needed in the first hours of work. It was the fastest meal in the repertoire. 20 minutes from start to finish. No complication, no special technique, no ingredient that might be missing or variable. And because of that absolute predictability, it was the meal that the youngest cowboys learned to make first. Because on a day when the cook fell ill or ran late, anyone needed to be capable of putting rice and molasses in a pan without destroying the group's morale. Molasses came in sealed metal cans that were protected with almost as much care as water. Spilled, it was an irreplaceable loss. Crystallized by the cold, it had to be warmed slowly beside the fire before it would flow again. It was an ingredient that demanded respect, and cowboys who did not respect it quickly discovered what it meant to have a morning with nothing sweet to start the day. The eighth meal was what they called chili, but not the spiced, elaborate version that Texas today claims with such pride. It was the original version, brutal, without a sophisticated name. Coarsely chopped meat cooked with dried red peppers and beans, all together in the pan for long enough that the flavors became indistinguishable from one another. The pepper was one of the few spices that the cook carried consistently, because beyond flavor, it had a function. The capsaicin present in chili peppers has antimicrobial properties and acts as a natural preservative. In a hot climate, with meat of uncertain origin and no refrigeration, adding pepper to the cooking was not merely a matter of taste. It was a primitive and effective way to reduce the risk that the food would cause illness before it could feed anyone. The Mexican vaqueros who worked alongside American cowboys on the great cattle drives were the primary transmitters of this knowledge. They knew how to use pepper, cumin, and dried garlic in ways that transformed the same basic ingredients into meals with identity and complexity. And gradually, those flavors were absorbed into frontier cooking and became part of what we now call Southwestern American cuisine. The chili in the pan was served thick, almost solid, with the broth reduced to a minimum. It was eaten with cornbread or sourdough biscuits that soaked up the dark, spicy sauce. And it was one of the rare meals that generated conversation around the fire, not about the food itself, but about who could handle the most pepper without showing discomfort. A silent and completely serious competition. The ninth meal was bone broth soup, the longest of all, and the one that best exemplified the zero-waste philosophy that governed Old West cooking. After an animal was slaughtered and all the meat removed, the bones went into the pan. Bones that most people today would discard without a second thought. Bones with minimal scraps of meat, with cartilage, with marrow still inside. Especially the marrow, considered by the older cowboys to be the most valuable ingredient of a slaughtered animal. The bones were covered with cold water and placed over low heat for hours. 4, 6, sometimes 8 hours of slow cooking. What happened during that time was a gradual extraction of collagen, minerals, and fat from the marrow that transformed the water into a dense broth, slightly gelatinous when cooled, of a dark amber color that signaled nutritional richness. That broth was the foundation of other meals, the liquid in which beans cooked, the water that rehydrated jerky, the element that gave body to mulligan stew when meat was scarce. It was culinary economy in its purest form, extracting the maximum from every available resource, with no hierarchy between noble parts and disposable ones, because on the Old West Trail the distinction between noble and disposable was a luxury no one could afford. Modern medicine has discovered what the cowboys knew in practice. Slowly cooked bone broth is rich in glycine, proline, and minerals that support joints, gut health, and muscle recovery. They did not know the names. They knew that men who drank the broth got sick less often and recovered more quickly. That was enough. The 10th meal was molasses pudding. Not a pudding in the sense we know today, but a dense, steam-cooked mass inside the lidded pan, which served as dessert on days when there was reason to celebrate or simply when the cook wanted to lift the group's spirits. Flour, lard, molasses, a little baking soda, and enough water to create a batter somewhere between bread and cake. The batter was poured into a smaller container placed inside the pan with water around it. Steam cooking inside the steam, inside the campfire. The pan's lid was sealed with a damp cloth to keep the steam inside. The result took an hour, sometimes more. It was dense, dark, with the intense flavor of molasses permeating every part. It was not light. It was not delicate. It was a frontier dessert, robust, satisfying, without pretension. Amos Webb prepared molasses pudding on specific occasions. When the group completed an important leg of the journey, when someone had a birthday, rarely remembered, frequently estimated, and on the eve of stretches he knew would be particularly hard. It was a quiet way of communicating to the group that the cook saw them, that he understood what they were facing, and that something beyond survival was happening in that camp. There was community, and community needed moments of celebration, however small they might be. The 11th meal was river fish, simple, direct, and entirely dependent on the luck and fishing skill of the group. When the trail crossed a river with fish, and many did, the pan took on a different role. The fish were cleaned quickly, without ceremony, and placed whole or in large pieces into the pan with hot fat. There was no flour for breading, no butter for browning. It was fish and fat and fire, and the result was a meat that stuck to the pan if the cook was not paying attention, but that when done right, and Amos always paid attention, came out with the skin crisp and dark on the outside, and the flesh moist and flaking on the inside. The fish was served with whatever was on hand alongside it. Beans, cornbread, rice, or simply alone, straight from the pan, eaten with the hands, when hunger had no patience for protocol. It was the meal that most depended on the moment, on the luck of crossing the right river, on the skill of whoever had fished, on the speed with which it was prepared after the catch. And for that reason, it was also the one that generated the most anticipation. On days when the group knew they would cross a river with fish, the topic dominated conversation for hours beforehand. Not because fish itself was extraordinary, but because it was different. And different, in the context months of beans and jerky, was almost enough to be extraordinary. The 12th meal was the one that closed the longest and hardest days. Coffee with softened hardtack. It was not a meal in the complete sense of the word. It was more than that. It was a ritual. Strong coffee, boiled directly in the pan with water and coarsely ground beans, served in metal mugs that burned your fingers. Hardtack, the stone-hard biscuit that lasted months without spoiling, dunked in a hot coffee long enough to soften to the point where teeth could break it without risk. It was the last thing the cowboys ate before sleeping. Not because it was good, because it was hot, because the coffee had caffeine that helped with the night watch shift that came shortly after. Because the act of sitting with the warm mug in your hands, looking at the dying fire, marked the official end of the workday. In their diaries and letters, the men who lived those journeys rarely described the great meals in detail, the days of successful hunting, the moments of abundance. What they described with an almost nostalgic precision was this last meal. The black and strong coffee, the hard biscuit that slowly gave way. The silence of the camp after a day that had cost everything they had. It was simple to the extreme. And because it was simple, it was the only moment of the day when no one needed anything more. 12 meals. 12 ways of turning the minimum into enough. What unites all of them is not sophistication, because there was no sophistication. What unites them is a practical intelligence that modern life has made unnecessary. The ability to extract the maximum from limited resources, without waste, without hierarchy between what is worthy of attention and what is not, without the illusion that food needs to be elaborate to be good. Amos Webb finished that 1874 cattle drive with the entire group alive and the herd intact. He arrived in Colorado 46 days after leaving Texas. On the night of arrival, he prepared son-of-a-gun stew with the last available offal, cornbread in the cast iron pan that had traveled every mile with him, and enough coffee for everyone. The cowboys ate in silence, as always. But that night, when they finished, one of them said something the others repeated afterward in letters home. That Amos's pan had been as important as any horse or pistol on that journey. That without it, there would have been no journey. It was the simplest truth of the Old West, and it remains true today. You can have all the equipment in the world, but if you do not know how to feed the people who depend on you, with what you have where you are, the journey will not go far. Amos Webb's cast iron pan knew that, and the 12 meals that came out of it knew it too. If you made it to the end of this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's a new story from the real side of history, without romanticism, without filters, without the version the movie sold you. And in the comments, which of these 12 meals would you try to make today? Which one seemed most brutal? Which one surprised you? Until the next video.